Last year, I wrote my BA thesis on Dark Souls and Seriality, which is the study of serial narration. And since the stress of meeting that particular deadline has finally faded from my mind, I thought it would be fun to revisit that paper. In case you're worried this means the video is going to be a bit more stuffy than my usual material, it's actually going to be the opposite. I already gave this topic a proper scientific write-up, lit review, endnotes and all, and I don't intend to apply that kind of rigor in my spare time. Rather, this is a chance to revisit some of these ideas with a more free-form approach, to see if they hold up. However, I'm still going to have to walk you through a little bit of theory. I'll try to keep it short. Also, I'm going to have Dark Souls footage running in the background because in my actual paper, I used this whole theoretical framework to analyze the plot of Dark Souls, but I'm not going to do that here because Dark Souls lore is one of the most over-discussed subjects on YouTube. Okay, then let's jump right into it. The point of my paper, in a nutshell, is that the way audiences enjoy TV shows, as theorized by Umberto Eco, can help us understand how players master the complex systems underpinning video games. In order to make that point, however, we first need to talk about how video games communicate with their players. There's an ongoing discussion about how to define video games academically, with various conceptual models of play floating around, but one common thread among them is that most tend to rely on the concept of a feedback loop, either implicitly or explicitly. These models can be pretty complex depending on how many individual stages you want to differentiate between, but I'm going to give you a pretty basic version here. You can find a more detailed version in the Frame of the Magic Cycle by Arsenault and Perron. So here's how the feedback loop works. The current game state is displayed on screen. The player absorbs this information and chooses their next action. The player then uses the controller to make their next move. And finally, the game state is updated, the new game state is again displayed on screen, and the cycle begins anew. Whenever we play a game, we go through this cycle many times per second without realizing it. This model simply helps us break down the process into individual steps in order to understand how games communicate information to their players, and how players, in turn, develop their own theories about the rules of a game and then test them by taking an action and comparing the result to their own expectations. This process is the most basic way in which we learn how a particular game works. For instance, can I make this jump? No. Does this game have fall damage? Yes. This model is great for examining how players figure out the rules of a game by simply playing it, but it doesn't really explain how players manage to formulate their own strategies in response to the hidden systems they uncover. Because games can only communicate with players through predetermined responses, they have a pretty limited vocabulary for showing us what we are doing wrong, meaning that it falls on us as players to take the right lessons from the fact that we keep dying over and over again. In the last video, we already talked about the fact that competitive games sometimes do a pretty bad job of showing players how to improve. Hearthstone, for instance, has a lot of visual feedback to show you that you are losing a match, but it doesn't really tell you why you are losing. Was it a bad matchup, was it bad luck, or did you make some sort of mistake along the way? Similarly, in League of Legends, flashing health bars on the grey screen clearly show that death is to be avoided, and the game even shows you what sources contributed to your demise, but that still doesn't really tell you what you should be doing differently. Could you have won that fight if you had played a little bit better, or should you have avoided it altogether? Should you have been a little further away from your opponents, or should you have been somewhere else on the map entirely? These are things that players don't and can't learn from the direct feedback provided on screen. These are things that players learn from experience, specifically by experiencing these kinds of situations over and over again with slight variations. And this process of repetition is something that the study of serialized media, especially TV, can help us shed some light on. In 1985, Umberto Eco published an article called Innovation and Repetition, in which he theorizes about why audiences enjoy the repetitive structure of TV shows. Around this time, TV was not yet widely recognized as a legitimate object of study. Many scholars saw sitcoms and similar programs as trash and dismissed them on the grounds that every episode was the same. Eco, however, points out that this should not be a reason to exclude TV from the pantheon of high art, given how many prestigious art forms are based around repetition. Poetry, for instance, followed very strict formal rules for much of its history and was typically filled with variations upon a very similar set of themes and motifs. Unattainable love, the fleeting nature of life, and so on and so on. Eco goes on to discuss the aesthetics of serialized TV and the larger problem of how to define art in the modern media environment, but the main takeaway for our purposes is a distinction he makes between different types of viewers in the TV audience. Those who are along for the ride, fully immersed in the content of each individual episode, and those who take a step back and appreciate the structural similarities and differences between individual episodes. Let me give you a key quote here. Every text presupposes and constructs always a double model reader, let us say a naive and a smart one. The former uses the work as semantic machinery and is the victim of the strategies of the author, who will lead him little by little along a series of provisions and expectations. The latter evaluates the work as an aesthetic product and enjoys the strategies implemented in order to produce a model reader of the first level. In other words, he enjoys the way in which the same story is worked over to appear to be different. It's a bit unfortunate that this distinction is steeped in such judgmental terms as naive and critical, but what Echo is basically saying here is that people watch repetitive programs like police procedurals for different reasons. Some approach each episode as its own unique story and follow the plot in detail. Others are aware of the structural similarities and focus more on the steps a show takes to differentiate episodes from one another and from other shows in the same genre. This type of viewer doesn't really care about the inevitable conclusion of the murderer being caught every single time. What they enjoy is being able to correctly predict certain aspects of the story, which we tend to think of as beating the author at their own game, although in reality, writers put in all the necessary clues because they want viewers to be able to guess what's going to happen. At this point, you might have already noticed some parallels between the way we approach video games and the way Echo describes the appeal of TV. In particular, it strikes me that the process of playing a game can be thought of in terms of transitioning from one type of viewer to the other. When you first start a game, you are bombarded with information. But the longer you play, the more you start to filter out details in order to focus on the mechanics and systems of the game. The first time you play an Assassin's Creed game, for instance, you might be taken in with the elaborate architecture of its cityscapes, but over time you start to look past these intricate details as you scan the environment for climbable surfaces. It's not just about filtering out details, however. It's also about building up a mental library of gameplay footage. While many hold up immersion as the ultimate ideal of gaming, the truth is that we are never fully absorbed in the action when we play a game. Rather, we are both taking part in events on screen and observing ourselves on screen at the same time. This process of viewership, of watching yourself play, is a critical but underappreciated part of how we improve at games. Just as TV audiences learn to identify the killer in a police procedural because they've seen enough of them, we learn the right way to play a particular Hearthstone matchup because we've seen it play out before. As we play and watch ourselves play, we essentially transition from a naive player to a critical player. It's worth noting that this is not just a passive process of soaking up information. Once a player has developed mastery over a game, especially ones that require a high degree of coordination, we tend to think of their skill set as something instinctual, not rational, like developing the right reflexes. And that's true on some level, but the path towards that instinctive response is still shaped by active review and reflection. You might, for instance, think back to your last couple of attempts at taking down a particular boss, and conclude that you always dodge too early when he does that overhead swing, helping you identify the area where you need to improve. The idea that we are both playing and watching ourselves play at the same time might sound pretty philosophical, but this model can actually help us make sense of a lot of the weird quirks we deal with whenever we talk about video games. Consider the way a game's themes and motifs fade into the background the longer you play. The first time you pick up Binding of Isaac, for instance, you might be grossed out by the fecal imagery and the narrative implications of certain items. But after a few dozen runs, all you're thinking about is which item gives you the best stat boosts. The distinction between naive and critical viewers allows us to explain this transition from focusing on the semantic content of a game to focusing on its underlying systems. And this transition can help us explain why video game genres are based on mechanics rather than settings and themes. Shooters, platformers, brawlers, builders, etc. In other media, the futuristic technologies present in both Mass Effect and Stellaris would lead them to be grouped into the same category, science fiction. But when it comes to video games, these titles are considered to be part of two radically different genres. This is because understanding a game's systems allows you to predict and anticipate more of its content than being familiar with its themes ever could. An understanding of sci-fi tropes might allow you to predict some of the twists and turns of Mass Effect's plot, but knowing how shooters work basically lays the entire game bare in front of you. It means you know how the cover system works, it means you know how enemies are likely to behave, it means you know that you're about to be ambushed when you see chest-high walls, and about to fight a boss when you see a room full of supplies leading into a big open area. Finally, this model also emphasizes that failed attempts are an important part of play, even though we tend to skip over them when we describe or discuss games. This is especially noticeable when it comes to linear games and the concept of the playthrough, a construct we rely on to imagine our journey through a game as one continuous experience, with all interruptions and failed tries edited out, similar to the way that games themselves typically consider our many on-screen deaths non-canonical. The best example of this is Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, where the frame narrative presents the events of the game as a story the prince is telling in hindsight, and anytime you die, you hear him say something like,
"That's not how it happened."
But while those failed attempts do not fit into the linear narrative of most games, Dark Souls being a notable exception that has a diegetic explanation for why your character keeps coming back to life, they are part of our experience as players, and they are more than just wasted time on the way to getting it right. All those deaths, all those lost matches and failed runs are the foundation on which our mastery over a game's systems is based. They represent the wealth of experience that allows us to formulate strategies, to correct for our own tendencies, and to see the patterns that go beyond the moment-to-moment feedback presented to us on screen. That's why I wanted to find a model that recognizes repetition as an integral part of our progression as players. And hopefully I was able to explain it in a way that makes sense to you. Thank you for indulging me on this slightly more academic take. I'll be back with something a little more traditional next time.